Hello.
Hello. Good morning.
How's it going? Hey, David.
Hello. Good morning. Hey, Doug, before let people join, the presentations that we've been talking about the last month or so, what folder are those under in the repo, or have they not been uploaded yet?
Oh, that is a good question. I think at least some of them are in Google Drive, but you're right. I should probably upload them to the repo. I forgot about that. Let me see where I put them. Hold on.
It doesn't have to be right now. It's just I had that as an item I had from last week, and I didn't. I want to go back and look at that stuff, and I didn't have a chance to do it, and hence the ask.
Yeah, no, it's a good question. Okay, so I see at least where mine is. I don't know if Clemens gave me his or Klaus gave me theirs. So hold on a second while we're waiting. Oh, man. Hold on. Because we did create a spot to put those. Didn't we? Oh, there's a share folder. Maybe that's what it is. Yeah, okay, there's a share folder there. Okay, yeah, I'll upload mine there, and thank you for the reminder. I will nag everybody else to give me theirs.
Thank you.
Yep. Let's see. Doug, Commons, Klaus, upload. To repo. It's under share folder.
So we get an action item even before the meeting starts.
Exactly. Yes.
That's tough.
we are slave drivers here. All right, Klaus, I heard you. Let's see. And
I'm here too.
That was Clemens. Lance, hello.
Hello.
And Ginger.
Hey, Doug.
Hello. John.
Hello.
Hello. Tommy.
Yo.
Yo. All right. Demob happy? Demo be happy? What are you trying to say there, John?
Demob happy was, as far as I'm aware, a phenomenon where soldiers who were just leaving the army because their tour of duty was over started being boisterous, let's say.
Okay. Never heard the term before. I've heard senioritis is the not is the senior no. Yeah, maybe it's senioritis, right? We're getting close to graduate from school, so you start slacking off. I've heard that before, but not that term though. That's interesting. All right. Hey, Eric.
Hello, Doug.
And Mr. Mitchell.
Good morning.
Hello.
Yes, apparently it's a British English thing.
Yeah,
so there we go.
I thought it might be a British thing. Demobilization. Oh, okay. Interesting.
It's almost something I've learned from this call that I can use in my actual life.
The question is, how would you pronounce it though?
Demob.
Demob or demob?
Demob, because you would talk about someone being demobbed.
Because with the word mob in there, it takes on a whole new meaning. So
yeah, yes, it's definitely not mob as in a rowdy mob of people.
Yes.
Yeah, it's just short for demobilization, I would assume. So
Yes, it is.
Yeah.
That's,
yeah.
and
Yes,
you
I
guys,
already, I already find the phrase British English entertaining because it's just English.
Yeah,
no, there is definitely American
or
English.
proper English. Yeah, there's
Proper.
definitely American English, but clearly English is the proper English.
That is true. I'll give you that. Yes. Yes. So you guys can see my Firefox window, right?
Yep.
Okay, so I want to make
Yes.
sure. Okay. And hey, Jesse.
Hey, good morning.
All right. One more minute. Small group today. Yes, today we learned something. Isn't that exciting?
British English is also funny because listen to a Scot and then you find like this is weird. Because that is also British English, but very different.
Yes. Hey, Ryan.
Hello.
All right. All right, let's go ahead and get started. We have, what do we have? 13 people. All right. Okay, thank you, Ryan. So just quick AI. Clemens and Klaus, can you guys either send me your presentations for the spec stuff or directly upload it into the share folder?
I will send.
Yeah, that's fine. Either way, just so we can make it available for everybody. I've been thinking about putting it in the Google Drive, but actually I like the idea of putting it into the share folder. That makes more sense. All right, let's go ahead and get started. So Clemens. Let me pick on you for a second here. You have 3 AIs up there, and you have at least 2 down here. Any chance of you kind of looking at those anytime soon? Clemens, you're on mute.
Yes, I promise. I will
Okay.
make progress on those until next week. I promise, dog.
Okay, thank you. I have to do my nagging. Okay.
Yes, no, you're right.
Okay, cool. Thank you. Let's see, anything else? Anything from the community people want to bring up? All right. As of now, we have nothing on the interop agenda. Let me know if you want to do something. Otherwise, we will cancel that meeting. Nothing new for KubeCon, at least as far as I know. And I don't see Timur, so get into the fun stuff. Okay. First of all, easy issue from Eric. I believe this is a carryover from last week's issue. I think, Eric, I'll let you talk to this one.
That's exactly right. I forgot to align the examples, the example bodies with the text of the spec.
Okay. And if I remember correctly, I think this one was the post. Just making sure they were too long. Yeah, this is just the post. Now includes the full stuff. And this one, I can't remember if this was a put or a delete. Which one is that? Let's
I think
see.
that one should also be the post, just
another
the post to a specific ID.
Right. Okay, so it's just saying we return everything on the post response. Per Clemens' brilliant idea last week, where it'd be nice if the client could see if anything was updated on them or new attributes added. So he would be able to update his local cache or something like that. All right, any questions about that? Any objection to approving? Cool, thank you all. All right, this one. All right, this is a minor one. However, they need to sign it, but I actually have a question here. So again, this is just the primer, and it's just some sample protocols and stuff. I actually feel a little awkward with this, mainly because I don't think the intent here was to have everybody in the world start listing their protocols here. We're not here to do advertising. Now, you could look at this and say, well, why do these guys get special treatment? And I agree, other than they were just happened to be there and we didn't care that much about it at the point in time. But I'm bothered that people look at the primer and say, hey, I want to get mine added too. And so I'm inclined to either, well, 3 options are obviously available. One is sure, accept this, who gives a crap. 2, nope, sorry, that wasn't the intent. We should just leave it as is and not, and fine, these guys got in there, let them special. Or 3, remove all of them.
It's not even clear that these are protocols as such. They're products.
Well, product, yeah, true.
And I think there can be a difference. If someone had a platform or vendor specific protocol, that might be slightly different. On the other hand, I think we have a pull request around adding something that is PubSub specific, and someone else may be able to remind me of this better. I'm sure I've seen something.
Do we have a pull request?
in the PubSub.
I know we had something in the agenda.
Oh, there is a PubSub protocol binding
There's
that's
this.
in Knative GCP. Yes.
Yeah, and Brian was supposed to submit a PR for that, which I think was okay, because even though it's proprietary, we were going to stick it under the, where was it? Was it extensions? No, where was it? There was no, proprietary. He was going to stick it over here or something like that, which is fine. We
Correct.
decided we want to do that. But that to me is different than this. And so I'm inclined to say remove them all, personally, if I had to choose.
Yep.
What do other people think? Do other people want to take the other approach and say, no, let everybody in? I just feel like that's awkward. But
I like removing them all.
Yeah, and we can leave platform specific protocols without examples. That's fine.
yeah, that's what I would prefer. Because, yeah, okay. Anybody disagree with that decision? And I could submit the PR to do that. Okay, cool, thank you.
So that implies close that PR?
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. Implicit approval there is to close that PR. Any disagreement with that? Okay, so let me do this. Approve to close. Oops, close. And then AI Doug. Open PR to remove all product this mentions. Okay, cool. Thank you all. All right, now Klaus, do you have something on this one you'd like to
just in time I added something to that issue, an example.
Wow, it's a long one.
Yeah.
Is that big enough? Or here, let me make it a little bigger so you guys can see it. There you go. Okay, I'll let you talk to it.
Okay, so the idea is that there is maybe some simple event forwarder that receives events in a structured format and forwards them in binary. And that event we have in here in the example, I invented some content type, happy plus JSON, but it has that plus JSON that triggers at least some SDKs, I think. And now I wonder what happens if it's forwarding that event in binary format. Is it A or is it B? And yeah, so if it's recognized as JSON, I think it should be B, because it's interpreting data as a JSON value of type string, and consequently then puts it in here with quotes. If it's not recognizing this happy plus JSON as a JSON content type, then it's would probably result in A, which is then not a valid JSON value anymore in the body. So my conclusion, and I think also from the others participating that lengthy discussion, is that the way it is specified right now, the SDKs should all have the same idea when to interpret something as JSON and when it should just be text content.
Thank you for this example. This helps me really understand it. Does the specification lean one way or the other, or is the spec basically silent?
pretty silent, I think.
Okay.
This is an excellent example. And again, thank you for putting it together. I do have a sneaking suspicion that it's highlighted an area of ambiguity that my guess is it will fairly rarely actually cause a problem. It would be nice to get consistency, but it's not keeping me awake at night, let's say.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's hear from any SDK folks. What do SDKs do? Let me pick on Lance, since I know you're there. For JavaScript, what did you guys do?
I mean, okay. Well, first of all, I said in the comments, this is a great example. And I don't know off the top of my head exactly what the SDK would do. I think it would do B.
Emphatically, thank you, Daniel. Emphatically doing B for Ruby, thank you. Okay.
I'm
Does
pretty
anybody-
sure that C# does A, but I would be very happy to change that. I think it detects application/JSON, but not happy plus JSON. But it would not be a problem, I reckon, to make it do that. I could regard that as a bug fix.
Okay. Does anybody think A is a valid choice? Not necessarily the right choice, but a valid choice.
Do you mean that it is JSON?
No, it's more, I guess I'm wondering if any of our SDKs receive A, are we expecting all of them to now fail and say it's an error? Or are we allowing them to accept this and say it's perfectly valid?
So there's a, so the question here is are we were, well, the decision point is whether you're detecting that this is JSON based on that notation in the content type, right?
Right. I'm assuming that the receiver knows it's JSON because the content type, yes.
Yeah, because the content type clearly says that it's JSON, and that is a 6839 RFC 6839, which we quote in the JSON format, and that is actually quoting the plus JSON structured syntax suffix. So my expectation would be in that particular example that plus JSON, because referenced, would be detected by the SDKs.
Okay, that's not quite what I was asking though.
So yeah, but how does the ambiguity come about?
I think the ambiguity is if you're given this and someone says, okay, you now have a cloud event generated in binary, which one do I generate, this or this? And I think from what I'm hearing on the call is this is the right answer.
Ah, okay. Good. Sorry, I thought we were still at the point where we might be confused about it being JSON. So we're not.
No,
yeah, so
I just wanted to turn it around though and said, okay, if you're now receiving A or B, well, I think we're agreeing this is the proper response.
correct.
If somebody was being really, really anal and wanted to not be permissive on bad stuff, should this technically generate an error?
Yeah.
Does everybody agree with that? I'm going to say silence is yes.
Generate
say
an
say
error
again,
when it's being decoded from the message to an in-memory representation of the event. When are you saying an error should be generated?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm not sure. Because it's possible that somebody could interpret this as just straight binary and not try to necessarily interpret it based upon this, right? I guess I'm assuming if there is some processing that says, hey, I want to, because this says JSON, if I want to convert this into a JSON object, and they're being really picky about it, should they technically have flagged this as an error, I guess is what I'm asking. I'm not saying SDKs have to, I'm just walking through the mental exercise of what ifs.
If you read the content type first and then you follow the rules and understand that it's plus JSON is JSON, then you will go and take the content body, will assume for it to be text, and will run it through a JSON decoder, which is then looking at byte marks, etc. But then trying to decipher it, and it will find an I, which is an invalid token for a JSON document to start with, will throw.
Okay, that'd be my assumption as well. Oh, Ryan, your hand's up.
Yeah, I'm not sure yet, but I do think from a spec perspective, we need to be careful because not every, you might have a situation where you have a proxy that's just doing routing. It doesn't care about the contents, the body, and only cares about, the headers, and it's just forwarding based on that. And so just want to be careful about in the spec, making it so that in those cases, they would have to emit an error when that's not typically their responsibility.
Yeah, that was not my intent. Like I said, this was just a mental exercise with a series of ifs. If someone chooses to analyze it, if they choose to look at the content type, they want to parse the data as JSON, and they want to be really anal and not accept stuff that's bad, would this be one of those cases where it would generate an error if they were interested in generating errors? And I think the answer is yes.
Gotcha. Okay. Yep, that makes sense.
Okay. Does anybody disagree? Okay, so Klaus, what now would need to happen if we're all in agreement that B is the answer? Does anything need to change in the specs? Do we need to be clear about this in the primer? Do the SDKs need to go back and make sure that they do whatever changes they may need to make to align with this decision? What do you think needs to happen next?
And I was just looking at the spec for the JSON format, and yeah, so there is this reference to which RFC is it? 4627, something like this. I'm not sure if that's clear enough. So maybe also there could be some might be this one that is making it clear. I don't know.
So, okay, well, let's go back to the original question.
Yeah.
Was it Kevin?
Okay, so yeah.
What do you think Kevin's looking for? Just clarity?
I think in the beginning there was more confusion about the whole handling. I'm not sure if the original question is, it has been a long discussion.
I think we have a bit of a problem because the JSON binding sort of says, sorry, JSON format says this is what is represented. It doesn't particularly talk about what an SDK should do, and arguably it possibly shouldn't, but something probably ought to. And I suspect that we end up with the SDK for JSON format should do this, and for protobuf format should do that, and etc. Almost as an addendum to any particular other spec document. Yeah, it's almost like maybe we need an SDK implications section at the bottom of each of our docs.
Well, where am I going? Go back to the group. We have, we do have this SDK doc here, which is supposed to provide SDK guidance. So we don't necessarily need to touch every single doc for every single language.
Yeah, but I suspect that you would end up needing to, and just looking at the size of the scroll bar, this is clearly not going to give really enough information. If you were implementing an SDK from scratch, if two people are implementing an SDK from scratch, going just on what we've got in specs, I would not particularly expect consistency. They could each implement things saying, well, I'm conformant with the spec, having made decisions that aren't specified, and we end up with inconsistency. Now we could massively extend this to include a section on every spec that has an SDK implication, or it could be spread across the other specs. I don't particularly mind that way. Either way, this is a big job, by the way. I'm not saying this is something that I hope to whip up in my free time, or anyone else should whip up just in in the next couple of weeks. We probably need to work out how important thorough consistency is, knowing that we probably haven't got it now. So I don't know quite what the plan would be to get there.
Okay, well, it seems to me that there should be some text added someplace, whether it's the primer, this SDK doc, or as you're suggesting, possibly even every single spec, or at least the JSON spec has some text in there. But it sounds like there's no normative text necessarily that needs to change. So now I guess the question is, who would like to take the action to craft such text? Klaus, would you be interested in taking a first pass at it? You kind of got sucked into this thing, or roped into this thing, I should say. But you did such a great job of explaining it. Oh, you're having you guys in Europe with your vacations, geez. Anybody else want to volunteer? Anybody care enough about this one? I can look through and see if anybody else commented.
I could try taking a stab at it. I think I kind of I'm the one who kind of reanimated this issue a few weeks ago. So
there you go. No good deed.
It came up for me, yeah.
Cool. Okay, thank you, Daniel. I appreciate that.
And Daniel, I'm happy to sort of be the person you bounce ideas off before it goes any further, like we did with the HTTP header stuff.
Thanks, John.
But I'm not around for most of the next week.
Great.
Hold on to option B in this one. Copy link. Cool. All right. So hold on a sec. Okay, whoops. All right. Anything else on this one we need to talk about? That was almost too easy, Klaus. With your example, it makes it perfectly clear.
And it does raise the question of what happens if there is no data content type. Is this still valid? And if so, what should happen, A or B?
I thought that there's text someplace that says if there's no data content type for a JSON format, it's implied that it's application/JSON. Is that
could well be right?
Yeah,
I'm sure that exists for something.
I remember that somewhere too.
Right.
In the main spec for content type or data content type in the documentation and definition of that attribute, it's mentioned.
Oops, data content type.
Yeah, there. I think this third.
Oh, that's interesting because that isn't specified. I've just looked for it in the JSON format documentation, and I don't think it is there.
I think it was quite a last minute change.
Yeah. I think we
there
should
were
probably
some
add
discussions.
We should add that to the JSON format documentation if it's not already there. If we agree that it should be there.
Wait a minute. Are you guys interpreting this chunk of text here to imply a missing data content type implies JSON or defaults to JSON?
For if it's in JSON format.
Well, how do we know that?
Because it says so there. Is the point here.
I mean, if I'm looking at a block of text, how do I know it's JSON without a data content type?
No, you're looking at a cloud event.
Correct.
That doesn't have a data content type, but does have data.
Oh.
Yes.
So okay, so because the cloud event itself is structured and because it's JSON, if this is missing, we can assume the data content type is not JSON.
Correct, Doug. How long have you been here?
I don't know. What's interesting. Okay, I'm trying to look at this with a fresh set of eyes because if you guys think that's what this is saying, I think we need to be a little more explicit.
Okay.
But okay.
That has been the concept all along. It was the idea of okay, the cloud event is already in JSON. It would be nonsense for us to having to say, hey, this is JSON when we then go and look at the data and the data is just containing structured JSON. That was this duality where we said the data content type only needs to appear if the content type of the data is different from the content type of the surrounding event.
Okay, never mind. I apologize. This sentence is perfectly clear to me. Okay, thank you. Never mind. I just was being stupid. Okay. So are we back to just Daniel has homework and nothing else? Or John, did you have something else you wanted to bring up?
I think that bit of the spec should be in the JSON format documentation, given that it's merely given as an example, but that's the only place it is specified, I think.
I agree. I can add that to the PR that I'm already going to do anyway. So
awesome.
Perfect. Thank you, Daniel. All right, cool. Anything else on this one then? All right. And Klaus, thank you again for putting that great example together. It makes it very clear. All right. John. Oh, did you, oh, go away. Did you want to talk to this one?
Yes. So what I'm not sure is how we best proceed with this. Partly, I don't know whether people have read this or not. And no blame associated. I'm rubbish at reading things I'm meant to read. But the proposal is effectively in two parts, one of which is how we version the specs themselves, which entails how we break them up into multiple versioned elements, let's say, and then separately what we do about representing those version specifications in GitHub. And they're not quite orthogonal, but they're relatively separable.
So
yeah, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, can I suggest that we tackle a very high order issue first, which is, do we want to split our repo into separate repos? Because I think that solves at least some of the problems if we decide to split. And I'm not suggesting we should split. I'm just wondering whether we can sidestep most of the discussion down here if we just say, yes, we're going to split the repos, and now's the time. And we were hesitant to do it before, but it's now we're going to do it.
It's
splitting repos. Splitting repos means splitting attention.
It does.
And so I'm at this point, I'm still worried about attention, and so therefore keeping as much in one place as we can. But my intuition is better.
Okay. Anybody else want to chime in? John, do you have an opinion since you've been doing the most thinking on this?
I think it can work either way. It's probably easier going from one thing to another within one repo. If this were code, it would be slightly harder, I think, or rather the decision would make more significant difference. The proposal I've got later on is one that I've used elsewhere, where effectively I've got multiple products within a single repository. And it means that we use tagging in a way that you only look at the tag for the product you're interested in. So if you look at the Discovery 2.0 tag, then what happens to be there in terms of schema registry or subscriptions or the core is irrelevant. And that we don't have to stabilize everything at the same time. Now that can be a little odd if you're coming from a single product per repo world. You can get used to it fairly quickly. I just want to highlight it as something to be aware of when you start looking at tags.
Okay, so before we get into that though, does anybody think now is the time to split the repos? Okay, not hearing any. Okay, John, maybe you could go into a little more detail about your proposal so people can get a better understanding of how that works.
So I think at the moment, I wouldn't like to fully say that I understand what we've got at the moment, but we definitely don't have a clearly delineated set of versioned elements. We have one. Actually, having said that, the front page of the repo does say that. For each different, it's got a separate, supposedly separate version for each event format and protocol binding and core specifications and primer. It doesn't currently show, as far as I can see, discovery or the other specifications that we're considering. So I would argue it's sort of sidestepping the issue at the moment.
Are you talking about this table right here?
Exactly, yeah.
Okay.
So what I'm proposing is, instead of treating those as that is a table that can have 10 different elements, we would say, no, all those are bound together, and that's one versioned thing. And maybe we explicitly need to make, suppose we come up with the XML event format, for example, is a one that we've got some ideas. Suppose that becomes merged and we wanted to do a 1.1, and we'll talk about minor versions in a bit, but this wasn't ready yet. We could explicitly have at the top of any page that isn't yet ready, okay, do not regard this as part of any specification yet. And then as soon as it became ready, if it's ready before 1.2 goes, then that becomes part of 1.2, rather than having a separate version for every single event format, etc. Now that potentially means if we do see a lot of churn, then even though the JSON event format hasn't changed, it's up to version 1.15 or whatever it is. My gut feeling is that we can be a bit more intentional than that and have relatively few releases. But all of this I'm very willing to be argued with on, and they're fairly weakly held opinions. Beyond, I strongly hold an opinion that what we've got isn't quite right. I weakly hold opinions about what is better. So I guess the first, if we agree that there should be clusters of versions or clusters of specs, each of which is a versioned element, then we need to decide what that cluster means. So that's my first proposal. And the second alongside it is, currently we say we follow semantic versioning, but the minor version's always got to be 0, which is sort of a not terribly helpful way of doing semantic versioning, because in theory it means you can never introduce any new features without going to a new major version. I think there are ways that we could, with thought, and this needs to be thought through fully and will impact SDKs, I think we can do things with minor versions. So I gave an example just above the GitHub section. If we had Cloud Events 2.0, because 1.0 is too far gone on the no minor versions, but if we had Cloud Events 2.0 and then we wanted to introduce a new optional attribute and it was always an integer, then that could be introduced into 2.1, and any 2.0 supporting SDK could support 2.1, could recognize a spec version of 2.1. It wouldn't necessarily know that it had to be an integer, this new optional attribute, but it could support it as far as it knew. Whereas any 2.1 supporting SDK would see, that's got spec version of 2.1, and you've given a string value or a non-integer value for this attribute. Therefore, I'll say it's a bad event. So you do end up with some potential inconsistencies with older SDKs being more lenient than newer ones, but it does mean that we can rev things without going to an entirely new major version more often.
Anybody want to comment? Okay, I'll jump in. I agree with you that technically, when we talk about we're following SEMVer, we're actually not. And if we added an optional new feature, technically it should be 1.1, but I think for whatever reason we decided it's always going to be a patch version. So the next one would be 1.02 instead of 1.1. But I look at that more as just, okay, we're playing fast and loose with what SEMVer means. And we can remove the word SEMVer from our documentation if we want to, if it makes people feel better. But ultimately, I think what matters is we've agreed that we don't want to touch minor version numbers because it introduces more problems than it solves. If we just treat everything as optional and everything's backwards compatible, whether we do it as a patch number versus a minor number, who gives a crap? You end up at the same
But it
result.
means we
Everything's
can-
compatible.
There is a difference with a patch number though, because the patch doesn't appear in the spec version of a cloud event. So if we have, suppose we have a retry count attribute, and to be clear, I'm not proposing this, with an integer value, then in a 1.0 event, a retry count with a value of foobar is entirely valid, but in 1.1, it wouldn't be. Now, does that make it a breaking change? I would say no, because any SDK that supports 1.1 should still be able to read a cloud event that says, I am a 1.0 cloud event, and the value of foobar for retry count is fine, because at that point, it's just an extension attribute. Whereas if you say, I am a cloud event spec version 1.1, and my retry count is foobar, then it's reasonable to say, no, that's not supported, because the SDK, the spec 1.1 says it's an integer. And while we've asserted that we don't put minor versions into the spec version part of the cloud event itself, we can't get any of that extra validation, etc.
So that actually sounds like it's a breaking change then, because someone could create a cloud event in 1.0 with retry count as foobar, assuming that it is simply an extension, and then send it to a 1.1 SDK, which then considers it a broken event.
No, but it's not a broken event, because the spec version travels with the cloud event. So it would have a spec version saying 1.0, and the SDK would have to honor that and say, okay, well, I didn't know about retry count back in 1.0, so I will leave it as it is. Whereas if the cloud event came up with saying, I am spec version 1.1, then it has the additional obligations, and the SDK would honor that. Now we could decide, okay,
but wait, John, I'm not sure that's right. I'm not sure that's right, because even if we did what you're suggesting there, I don't think your phrase, it has additional obligations, is true, because it's always optional for the receiver to adhere to it.
Are you saying an SDK shouldn't validate that attributes have the right type or have valid values for the...
An SDK that supports 1.1 could treat that new field as optional, and it's just an extension. It doesn't have to understand it, even if it's at 1.1, it's optional.
If I would say if it supports, it's an optional field, but if the SDK says, I support the 1.1 spec version, and a cloud event comes in that says, I am a cloud event of spec version 1.1, and my retry count is foobar, then I would say that's broken, in the same way as if something comes along today and says, I have a time attribute of value foobar, I would expect every SDK to say, no, that's not valid, because the time attribute must be date time.
Well, that's different though, right? You have to, a server has to support the time. It doesn't have to support retry.
But an SDK that says, I know about spec version, I support spec version 1.1, does need to know about retry count, because that's part of spec version 1.1.
But I'm not sure that's true, right? Because spec 1.1 says it's optional for the receiver to understand this field.
No. It's an optional attribute, as in it doesn't have to be present on every event, but the SDK itself, I would expect to know about that attribute and validate it appropriately. Sorry if my use of optional was confusing there, I'm sorry.
No, I think, this is a good point, because I think we even had long discussions in the past about what does optional mean? Is it optional to send or optional to understand, right? And I think this directly goes to that.
Okay, I was not privy to those conversations. I have always regarded optional as this doesn't have to be present on the cloud event. I would be really surprised. So let's find an optional attribute, because I think this could be at the core of disagreements. So if someone specifies so time is an optional attribute. If someone specifies a time of foobar, would you expect any SDK to say, yeah, that's fine?
Good question.
And it says, if present, must adhere to the format specified in.
Right.
Yeah. So I would, that's how I've always interpreted optional attributes.
So that's interesting, because I think what Daniel was saying before is true, though, because if in 1.1 we define an attribute called retry and we say if present it must be an int, right?
Yep.
If somebody has been using an extension called retry and they define it as a string, did we now break them?
Not if they still produce events that say I am a 1.0 event.
Correct.
It does stop them from upgrading to 1.1 events, and if there are two attributes and they're expecting the SDK to handle some other attribute in a particular way because it says it's a 1.1 event, but they happen to have got a conflict, then I think they're SOL. But
so I'm not so sure that's true, because I don't think a 1.1 spec can add a must. And still claim to be backwards compatible.
So I guess it depends on what we mean. What does it mean for a new version of the spec to be backward compatible?
Yeah, I think that's the point. If you have an extension which is which has a retry extension which uses a string, and then you have 1.1 of the spec that defines it using an integer, that 1.1 of this version of the spec is no longer compatible with that extension.
I think that's right.
Right, but it's also not compatible with 1.0. Because you've now broken something at 1.0 level.
No. I mean, the event will say 1.1.
But that doesn't matter. But the point of making a minor version is that you're still, everything from 1.0 still should work as is, right? If you're completely backwards compatible. If it wasn't backwards compatible, then you'd have to call it 2.0.
And that's the thing. I would expect everything that was specified in 1.0 to still be specified in the same way. So I would suggest that adding a new optional attribute shouldn't be regarded as a breaking change, whereas changing the time attribute to say, oh, now it's a string, that feels like it is a genuinely breaking change. Or string's probably a bad idea. Int, for example, every timestamp's a valid string. So it's a sort of what was present before is still present in a compatible way, but there can be new things. And yeah, I mean, this is the same across everything in terms of if you try hard enough, any change to anything, any library or whatever can break someone. I think there's a law about it somewhere.
Yeah, but it seems to me that, so I agree with you, you should be able to add optional attributes in the sense that, yeah, we're defining new things that can flow on the wire. But I'm wondering, and maybe I'm thinking about this incorrectly, I'm wondering whether you can add the must adhere to part in a minor release. I think 1.1 can say, hey, by the way, here's a field called retry, and it should be an integer. But I don't think you can say it must be an integer. Because like I said, I don't think you can add musts in a minor version.
But I'm not quite sure what it means for an attribute to have a type and say the value doesn't actually have to be compatible with that type. And in particular, suppose, would you accept something that's that says I'm a 1.1 event, but I've got this weird foobar of retry? Would you expect an SDK that otherwise does handle retry and has special, you know, it increments the number when it forwards it or something. I don't know. Maybe it's hop count or something. Would it just ignore the foo bar, pass it on, or are we really saying adding optional attributes is too complicated to be feasible precisely because of this?
So my interpretation was, and I'd love to hear other people who are involved in the standards world as well, like, you know, Clemens and Klaus and those guys. My interpretation is you can add the optional stuff, but you can't necessarily guarantee what the receiver is going to do with it. Right. That's why we included things like must understand and SOAP, right? That says, hey, I'm adding extra headers here, but I can't be sure that you understand it because you can silently ignore them. That's why the must understand attribute thingy was added. It says, hey, if you do not even understand this, can go and reject it. I think adding an optional attribute or adding an additional optional attribute falls in the same category to me, right? You cannot be guaranteed the other side is going to understand what the heck it is. And that's why you can't say it must adhere to a certain thing.
But Doug, you are already putting a constraint on it by having a type on it. So what we're saying here is we have a type. We called out that it must adhere to the format specified in RFC 3339, but we actually have a type system that's already doing this. So this is kind of this is duplicated, if you will. But the type of the attribute is already constraining it such that you have an implicit must rule.
No, I'm saying that on a new attribute called retry,
yeah,
you can say it should be an integer, but in a 1.1 you cannot say it must be an integer because somebody already could have retry as a string, and you cannot break them in a 1.1 spec and still be backwards compatible.
I think we had. I recall we having a very similar argument a while ago, and I think to remember that. So we went into the same circle, and that's why I think that's why we convinced ourselves that we can't have minor versions, because we landed there. We landed at that constraint for a reason, and that was that we could not find a way to make minor versions work. I recall something like this, but it's been a while.
But
I guess the question is, so there are definitely ways in which a minor version, if someone who has a working event in 1.0 and just decides to say, I'll send the same event but claim it's 1.1, that could break things. The question, I guess, is whether that risk is greater than the value that we could gain from adding new optional attributes.
But John, this goes back to what Clemens is saying. That's why we specifically said we will never bump up the minor version number.
Right, and I'm kind of saying we should revisit that. I'm not convinced by. I wish I'd been in the discussion back then, and maybe that would have convinced me. It feels to me like major versions are so disruptive of ecosystems that we should regard them as a thing of last resort. And if we can add functionality and value, even with a very minor corner case situation where, don't forget, I'm saying if you still send a 1.0 event with the weird thing that isn't valid as 1.1, that should be fine, and SDKs should handle that correctly. So it's only if you decide to say that your 1.0 event is valid 1.1, and it depends on what we mean by backward compatible. If you wanted to, if the bar for compatibility was every 1.1 event has to be valid as a 1.1 event with a spec version of 1.1, then I completely agree it would fall down. I suspect that that bar is higher than provides maximal value. but I now want to go away and think about it more.
I also have this nagging feeling that we also decided not to do minor version numbers because we didn't want to change what was on the wire. Right? Once you start introducing minor version numbers, even if we did what you were saying, John, it then becomes sort of a matrix hell of what to support and what people can and can't do.
It's certainly difficult. The C# SDK became significantly simpler when we said, do you know what? It's been ages since it went 1.0 and supporting 0.1, 0.2, and 0.3 was really hard. Let's just go for 1.0. That made things much simpler. But I would, the trouble is we don't know what we'll want to do. we have no idea what we might want to add. And maybe this is something to punt on until we're facing 2.0, because to be clear, I'm not proposing, we can't start saying, well, it could be 1.1, because we've said in the 1.0 spec that we don't support minor versions. So we'd have to go to 2.0 already. And maybe when we go to 2.0, we can have more experience about what we're trying to change and what other changes might come in the future.
Trying to figure out where to go aside from lunch.
Well, one thing is we can move on to the other aspect, which is clustering specifications. If we can cluster the specifications, whether or not we handle minor versions, and frankly, we could not have any minor versions in core, but still have minor versions in discovery and schema registry, etc. And I suspect we'll have to, unless we want to say that we're not adding any RPCs in the discovery protocol without a new major version, for example. That feels over the top to me. I think it's got fewer compatibility issues than core. So we could think about the clustering, or we could think about what we do in GitHub. And it sounds like the broad option of we should keep it all in one repository has rough assent.
Probably.
There is then, Doug, your proposal of creating directories instead of branches or tags.
Yeah.
Which might be worth folks thinking about.
Yeah.
Even if it's just if you describe it now and then we can talk about it.
Yeah, sure.
Time.
Yeah, because I think I understood what you were proposing up here. My initial reaction was I was kind of confused by it. I was wondering whether it would be easier if we want to allow different groupings to be versioned independently. Obviously, the GitHub branch concept or tagging concept introduces a problem there, right? Because that a branch or a tag has a particular version number, and it versions the entire spec, not a subset of. I'm sorry, versions the entire repo and not just a subset of the repo. So what if we just completely
need to interpret it as this is only this tag only applies to that particular directory within the repo.
Exactly, right. And I thought that, well, like I said, I think I understood what you're saying. I think asking a newbie coming to the repo to understand that don't look at the GitHub stuff and look at these other tags wherever they may be kept is really the more important thing. And it's only directly specific. I think that might confuse people. And so my idea was, well, what if we not use branches at all, right? We only have one branch in GitHub, but every time we create a new release, we create a new subdirectory. And then it just becomes life before Git, basically. Right?
Well, yes, so that's my main objection is we're using source control, but we're not really. We're doing source control by copying folders.
Yeah, I mean, well, we are using source control in the sense that it's you check in, check out stuff. But
we have
the minute you create a new version, you create a new subdirectory, and you copy everything in there. But at least then there's no confusion in terms of what people are looking at. So the question is it who are we making life easier for, right? And or us versus readers of the repo.
or my gut feeling is a reader of a repo would immediately go, hang on, why aren't they using version control for this?
Maybe, or they could always just follow links, right? And then they'll never pay attention to the versioning at all. Because I'll be honest with you, I still have to continually stop myself and go back up to the top here and make sure that this thing's checked properly. And I'm about half the time I'm pointing to the wrong one.
Right, and to be clear, my proposal, you've mentioned branches several times. In my proposal, we would only need a new branch if we need to go and fix an error in an earlier version. So this is, I'll put a link to the repo that I spend most of my time in for work into the chat. And this is what we do. So you'll see we only have 7 branches, but we have over 1,500 tags. We have created branches when we've absolutely had to, because we needed to go back. We needed to create a branch from a tag so that we could update stuff. And we've done that very rarely. Whereas we have a lot of tags, which apply then only to certain directories under there.
And you don't find 1,500 tags a bit overwhelming for newbies?
Well, this is, we wouldn't have that many tags because this is a repo that contains like 100 libraries worth. And it's being released all the time. I suspect we would have, maybe 20 tags in a couple of years' time. So that would be 2 releases of 10 specs. Actually, I think I suggested something like 4 specs. And while we only use patch numbers, it's not entirely clear to me what a release means, because it can't mandate anything. It can't mandate any changes whatsoever, because everything's got to be completely backward and forward compatible. Okay.
Oh, sorry, John. I didn't notice your hands up. John, did you want to jump in here?
Yeah. I think my question kind of follows with what you were talking about, Doug. Is like, who are we trying to help here, right? And how much complexity are we talking about adding to the case where some random IC is going to come in and, hey, I need to fix a bug in my system that's using cloud events, and I need to figure out what's the difference between these 2 versions and those kinds of things, making it hard for them to look across versions and find the info and try and figure out some of the history or whatever. That just seems like a bigger barrier to usability for people doing real work, as opposed to perhaps people like us trying to do spec work.
So to tease apart I think there were 3 things you said that the hypothetical user would do, one of which is seeing a version at a particular, seeing a spec at a particular version. One was seeing the history, and I didn't remember the third one. I would suggest that a link to the right directory or the right file within the directory at a particular tag, having that in the README on the master branch, or main branch if we get to rename it at some point, would solve that. For history, I think we should have human readable history rather than Git history anyway, and that's a slightly different matter exactly where that lives. I didn't catch what the third one was, and I completely agree, by the way. We want to make this usable, although it would be lovely to know what proportion of people interacting with our repo are us versus external people actually bothering to read a spec.
Yeah. All right. Technically, we're out of time. John, how would you like to proceed on this one?
I think I want to think more around minor versions, and I would like other people to as well. If we can have a similar discussion. I don't think there's any rush for this, which is a good job given how long I've taken even to get this far. if people could come to, whether it's the next meeting or whenever we can next afford some time, with fairly concrete thoughts around how the specs should be clustered, I'm hoping that's probably the least controversial bit.
Okay, so basically this section up here.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Let me make a note there. Where is it?
And I would say, please don't interpret my passion around versioning for inflexibility. I can argue passionately for my point of view, but if other people feel differently in the end, I will go with the flow, I promise.
No, this is a fun and challenging topic. All right, cool. I know people are starting to drop. Did I miss anybody for the attendee list? I think I got everybody. We had about 13, 14 people. Yeah, I think I got everybody. Okay, in that case, just double check. Anybody have any topic for the interop or discovery interop? I don't think so. Okay, in that case, we'll call it a day. All right, thank you all very much. We'll talk again next week. Bye, everybody.